Hello, and welcome to another live chapter reading of Caught in Midnight Shadows, the Caught series, Book 4, by Sharleen Scott, as presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. An eerie silence crept through the room. No bustling staff, no monitors beeping. Brant Bellamy stood at the door of the hospital room with its charred Stetson gripped in his hands. She'd taught him from an early age it was polite for a man to remove his hat, and shortly after her death he afforded her the courtesy. He took a deep breath and let it out as a petite woman stepped to his side and wrapped her arm around his waist. "You got my text?" she asked with a sniff. He nodded. "I came as soon as the fire crews started to mop up." "Damn," he said with a heavy sigh. "I should have been here. She was always there for me. Always." He glanced down at the woman next to him, fighting to control the moisture building in his eyes. "She was always there for me, too." She gave him a squeeze. "She wasn't alone, though. I sat with her and held her hand until she swallowed hard and blinked away her cresting tears. "Thank you, Hazel. I know how much she meant to you." "The world," she said with a sad smile and quivering lip. "Since we were girls." "Did she say anything? Anything at all?" She hadn't spoken since the attack, and he'd hoped she'd regain consciousness and shed some light on who did this to her. "Not to me, but she said something to a nurse. Hold on a sec. I've got the note in my pocket." She located the paper scrap and handed it to him. "The nurse thought this is what she said." Brant unfolded the small note written on the back of a prescription pad and frowned. "Find him and make it right," was all it said. He thought he knew what she meant. The information had resided in the back of the office safe for years, judging by the condition of the large manila envelope he'd discovered several days ago. But he couldn't deal with it now. Delving into her past would make him angry, and he wanted his heart and mind clear as he planned his mother's funeral. Next week was soon enough. They stood in silence a moment longer before Brant stepped from the room, not wanting to view the battered form beneath the sheet any longer. He wanted to remember her as the strong and vibrant woman she'd seen throughout his life. He leaned against the wall as the enormity of the day settled in. His mom, Thea Bellamy, the heart and soul of the Bellamy Ranch, was gone. She was a fighter and had held firm right up to the day of the attack, not bowing to the pressure to allow access across the ranch to the public lands slated for drilling. Wyoming had a long history with the oil companies, and he knew a lot of ranchers were allowing it. For the good of everyone, they said. He didn't criticize their choices. Everyone had their own opinions and their own paths to follow. But he and Thea had watched the destruction of pasture lands, the loss of groundwater, increases in dust, and the overall effect it had on the community and ranch life in some areas. They had decided, as a family, not to allow access across their land. He suspected that decision had cost Thea her life. The fight was his alone now. He closed his eyes a moment and blew out a breath. "Any idea on the cause of the fire?" Hazel asked. He shook his head. "Not yet, but I imagine it'll be arson, just like the other two." He'd lost 3 outbuildings to date and had been inside 2 of them when the fire started. He was beginning to take it personally. He rubbed at his singed hand and noticed burnt patches on his coat sleeve. He'd been in the tack room when he smelled the smoke. Late spring snow had drifted deep against the building in the last storm, and he'd only shoveled out 1 door. Someone must have watched him go in and used an accelerant. The old building went up like kindling. Luckily, he'd recharged the fire extinguishers recently and escaped before the building was engulfed. 3 times now. Somebody wanted him scared or dead. "Has Hank been notified of her death?" Brant asked Hazel, referring to his friend, Sheriff Hank Stafford. She nodded. "He was here, and it looked like we've got a possible homicide investigation now she's died." He saw the note and said he'll be out to see you tomorrow. Brant clenched his teeth and nodded. They'd called Hank when Thea disappeared a week ago, and he'd been with Brant when he found her in a rocky ravine at the back of the ranch, broken and crumbled, with a cracked skull and bruises covering her body. Her attacker tried to make it look like an accident, but her injuries weren't all consistent with a fall. From the looks of it, she'd been dragged there and put up a fight, but they won in the end. He stayed long enough to handle the formalities with the hospital staff before heading home. The kids were staying with the neighbors and had been since the fire started earlier that afternoon. It was late, and he debated leaving them for the night, but changed his mind at the last minute. Texting he was on his way, he knocked on the neighbor's door, brought 3 anxious kids into his arms. "Grandma?" Sophie asked. Her smeared makeup indicated her emotional state. At 15, she was old enough to know what was going on. "She died," he said with a choke. Mac and Hunter held on tight, not even trying to control the tears the dark-haired 8-year-old twins considered babyish. They maintained the group hug until Brant felt he could let go. He didn't know what he'd do without his kids. They'd been through so much together and were his strength. "Get your stuff and we'll head home." He noticed his neighbor hanging back in the shadows. "Thanks for letting them stay, Eric." "Anytime. They're good kids, and we enjoy having them." "Glad to hear they behave themselves," he said. "They always do," Eric said with a smile toward the kids. "Let us know if you need anything, Brant. We lost a good one today." That we did. He grabbed Sophie's backpack and ushered the kids to his crew cab Silverado as light snow fell. It would be a long night full of tears. "Dad," Sophie said with an uncustomary whine from Brant's office door. "It's only been 2 weeks since Grandma's funeral. Why do we have to go?" She brushed her straight blonde hair from her eyes and gave him an exaggerated pout. Brant dropped his feet from the desk corner where they'd rested before Sophie interrupted his thoughts. He covered the papers he'd been studying as his boots hit the floor. "Because I have to go out of town on business, and you can't stay here. It isn't safe for you." "But Chicago? For 2 weeks? We just got out of school, and there's stuff going on I want to do. Why can't we stay with Eric and Joan again? They like us and always say we can come back." She crossed her arms and tried to look tough. "We'll help with the chores." He gave her his best no-nonsense stare. "Like I said, it isn't safe, and I don't want to bring trouble to Eric and Joan. We don't know who is behind all this stuff going on around here, and I can't risk you and the boys. You'll stay with your mother in Chicago until I get back." "And Sebastian?" she said, wrinkling her nose. "Last time he made us go to the opera. Can you believe it? Clay Masterson was in town for a big concert, and Sebastian made us go see The Barber of Seville." Brant suppressed a smile. Sebastian had been as thrilled to take them as they'd been to go. "It was a good cultural experience for you. Now you know what The Barber of Seville is." "I watch cartoons, Dad. I know about The Barber of Seville." She made a face and mimed Bugs Bunny as the barber. "And that's why it's good you went. Bugs Bunny is great, but there's a big difference between a performance at the Chicago Opera Theater and a cartoon." He grinned at the pained face she made. "Your mother thinks I'm raising you to be backwoods, cattle ranch bumpkins, so you'll have to endure it. She's terrified you'll be like me." He couldn't count the number of times he'd attended an opera or a symphony performance during their marriage, trying to make her happy. He'd never accomplished it. When the bank offered the promotion to corporate headquarters in Chicago, she packed up and left with barely a backward glance at her husband and 3 kids. Ex-husband now, for the past 3 years, and custodial parent. She hadn't even challenged him. "Maybe she should have stayed here," Sophie mumbled, "if she was so concerned about us." "No point in going over ancient history," he said. "She and Sebastian are happy together, and we'll leave it at that." He walked toward his daughter and put his arm around her shoulders. 2 weeks isn't so bad. I'll probably miss you more than you'll miss me." She leaned in his shoulder. "Hardly." "This trip is important, Soph. Grandma did some things in the will that left the ranch at risk, and I have to go take care of the problems she created." "Like what?" "Legal problems you wouldn't understand," he said with an intentional vagueness. At this point, he didn't understand why she didn't, why she did it and couldn't explain it to his daughter until he did. But why Oregon? You're going to the beach without us. That's like criminal or something to go to the beach and leave your kids in the Midwest. She looked up at him with pleading eyes. I have a new swimsuit I've never worn. Please. People wear thermal underwear to go to the beach this time of year in Oregon, he said with a chuckle. I won't be spending time on the beach anyway. There's someone there I need to talk to. Then call him and stay here with us. He shook his head. That won't work. I need to find him and talk face to face. He kissed the top of her head and let go. I'm almost done with my work in here. How about making us all some tuna sandwiches and soup? At least Mom has domestic help. I'm not expected to cook for them like slave labor, she said. I doubt Sebastian would eat anything I fix anyway. He's such a snobby shit. She ducked out the door. Watch your language, Sophie. That's what Grandma called him, she said over her shoulder as she headed to the kitchen. Brant shook his head as he returned to the large mahogany desk and dropped into his chair. The ranch had been run from this office and this desk for generations, beginning with his great-grandfather, and became mostly his domain 10 years ago when Thea decided it was time for him to take over. She'd still contributed to the large decisions, but Brant took care of the day-to-day operations, along with his foreman, Kelton Wade, whom he trusted like a brother. Kel would take care of the ranch in his absence and report anything out of the ordinary to Brant and the sheriff. If his suspicions were correct, and the attacks were personal, the fires would cease while he was gone. He glanced out the window at the burnt ruin of his barn and the Bighorn Mountains in the distance, and he hoped he was right. He wanted his kids to feel safe here again. The papers on the desk caught his attention, and he blew out a frustrated breath. Find him and make it right, she'd said. He'd never met the man he thought she referred to, but knew of him from comments she'd made over the years. A man who had somehow coerced his strong and confident mother into changing her will. He couldn't figure out what possessed her to do it, especially with the oil drilling specter looming on the horizon. Brant had a fight ahead of him to protect his land, and he couldn't have a stranger in control of any part of it. His lawyer, Grayson Edwards, said he'd look for the guy, but Brant wasn't waiting and planned to look for him himself. He picked up a stack of papers and rifled through them. Some contained clues to the stranger's identity, everything but his real name. When this con man came to Wyoming 40-odd years ago, he'd called himself Jim Norman. He disappeared, and she never saw him again. The notes indicated she may have located him in the recent years, though, and Brant needed to find him and parse this thing out. His mother changed her will recently and was then murdered. Someone tried to burn Brant alive twice. Was it a coincidence? Or was the con man trying to gain control of the ranch and sell them out? All he knew at this point was the man may be in the coastal town of Angel Beach, Oregon, and he played a guitar. Chapter 2. Aubrey Cartrand cruised into the parking lot of Masterson's at Angel Beach on her wicked red Harley-Davidson Street Glide Special, feeling like a queen. The forecast threatened to douse her good mood with a downpour, so she seized some real estate under the building's eaves, shut the bike down, and pulled it to the kickstand. She'd probably need her rain gear on the way home, but the bike would stay dry for now. She caressed the fairing with her gloved hand, and closed her eyes a moment, and thanked her Aunt Matilda, Tilda for short, for helping her realize this dream today. She'd always wanted a touring bike, and never imagined she'd own a new Harley Custom Badger. Unfortunately, she had to lose the person she loved most to obtain it. She blew out a breath and shoved the sadness aside to deal with later. She climbed off the bike and removed her helmet. Shaking out her dark blonde hair as she moved toward the door, she heard an appreciative whistle and was ready to slam the sexist man who dared whistle at her when she was sidetracked by the most handsome cowboy she'd ever seen, and here at Masterson's she'd seen some of the best. His appearance didn't excuse his rude whistle, but she'd take a moment to appreciate the view of those broad shoulders before putting him in his place. That's a beautiful bike, he said as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the motorcycle. Fresh off the showroom floor? You got it, she said with pride. Do you ride? Four-wheelers and horses, mostly these days, but I have in the past. He glanced up at her and smiled. This beauty is a lot of power for a lady, isn't it? He tipped his head toward the bike. Apparently she'd made the wrong call about the whistle. That's quite an assumption you're making, cowboy, she said with a laugh. That you can handle that much power? She walked toward the door. No, that I'm a lady. The word lady implied prissiness in her mind, not a strong and confident woman. He grinned. Can I buy you a drink? That's all for now. Hope you enjoyed the chapter reading. Have a good night.